Danielle Harrington stepped out of her sleek black car and adjusted the simple beige coat she had chosen for the day. As the CEO of Harrington Financial, one of the largest black-owned banking institutions in the country, she was used to commanding boardrooms and making million-dollar decisions. But today, she wasn't entering the bank as a powerful executive. Today, she was just another customer. She had decided to go undercover, wearing no expensive jewelry, no designer handbag, just a modest outfit that wouldn't give away her status. She wanted to experience firsthand how everyday customers were treated at her bank. There had been whispers, complaints, subtle but concerning. Customers of color felt they were being treated differently, and Danielle needed to see for herself if the accusations had merit. As she walked through the glass doors, the scent of freshly brewed coffee filled the air. A few tellers were busy with customers, and a security guard stood at the entrance. Danielle stepped in line, observing everything. She saw a white couple being greeted warmly, their transaction handled quickly. A black man in business attire, however, seemed to be getting extra scrutiny from the teller. When it was finally Danielle's turn, she approached the counter with a warm smile. "Good morning. I'd like to withdraw $5,000 from my account." The teller, a young woman with blonde hair and an indifferent expression, barely looked up. "Do you have an account here?" she asked. Danielle nodded and slid her ID and bank card across the counter. The teller glanced at them, then pursed her lips. "I'm sorry, but I need to verify some things. Please wait." Danielle raised an eyebrow. Something felt off. She stepped aside, watching closely as the teller walked toward a manager. What happened next would leave her speechless. Danielle stood patiently, but her instincts told her something was wrong. The teller whispered to a middle-aged man in a navy blue suit, likely the branch manager. His eyes flicked toward Danielle before he sighed and shook his head. She caught bits of their conversation. "She doesn't look like she has that kind of money," the teller murmured. Danielle's fingers curled into her coat pockets. A slow burn of frustration built in her chest. This was exactly why she had come undercover, to see if the concerns from black customers were real. And now she was experiencing it firsthand. After a few moments, the manager walked over, his polite smile feeling forced. "Ma'am, we'll need additional verification before processing this withdrawal." Danielle kept her tone even. "I've already provided my ID and bank card. What more do you need?" The manager adjusted his tie. "It's just standard procedure for large transactions." She glanced at the teller, who looked at her with subtle suspicion. "Is it because I just saw that couple withdraw a similar amount with no issue?" The manager stiffened. "That's not." Danielle folded her arms. "Not what? Not the same situation? Not the same kind of customer?" A few people in line began to take notice. A man in a gray suit turned his head slightly, curious. A young woman with a laptop paused her typing. The energy in the room shifted. "Man, we're just doing our job," the manager insisted. Danielle exhaled, keeping her composure. "Fine, verify away, but I'd like to speak with corporate after this. I happen to know the CEO personally." The manager smirked. "I doubt that." Danielle gave him a knowing smile. He had no idea what was coming. Danielle kept her expression neutral, though irritation simmered beneath the surface. The manager's smirk told her everything she needed to know. He didn't believe she had any real connections, let alone the power to challenge his authority. "Very well," she said smoothly. "How long will this verification take?" The manager glanced at the teller. "At least an hour, maybe more. We need to confirm your account details and ensure everything checks out." Danielle raised an eyebrow. "An hour? For an account that's been active for over a decade?" "That's just how things work," he replied dismissively. She noticed how other customers were being served without issue, their transactions processed in minutes. A well-dressed man in a navy blue suit withdrew a hefty sum and walked out without so much as a second glance from the staff. Danielle turned back to the manager. "You didn't verify his transaction." The manager's lips pressed into a thin line. "That's different." "How?" she challenged. The air in the bank grew tense. A few customers subtly listened in, sensing something wasn't right. A woman holding a checkbook frowned in disapproval. The man in the gray suit from earlier watched the exchange with quiet intrigue. The teller shifted uncomfortably. "Would you like to cancel the withdrawal request?" Danielle smiled, cool, calculated. No, I'll wait. She pulled out her phone and sent a quick message. If they wanted to play this game, she would let them. But soon, they'd realize exactly who they were dealing with. Danielle sat in the waiting area, her patience wearing thin as she watched customers come and go, their transactions handled without issue. The manager, still smug in his stance, avoided eye contact, acting as if she didn't exist. She checked her watch. 20 minutes had passed. They were deliberately stalling. With a calm yet authoritative demeanor, she picked up her phone and made a call. The bank employees barely paid attention until she spoke. Mr. Reynolds? Yes, I'm at one of our branches, and there seems to be an issue with my withdrawal. The manager's eyes snapped toward her, his expression shifting from confidence to uncertainty. I've been waiting for verification on my own account for over 20 minutes now. Yes, no, it's not a new policy. It seems to be selective. The color drained from the manager's face. He suddenly realized who she was talking to, David Reynolds, the regional director. Danielle kept her voice even, but the undertones of authority were unmistakable. I'd appreciate it if you could look into why I'm being treated differently than other customers. Yes, I'll hold. The entire bank fell silent. Employees exchanged nervous glances. The teller swallowed hard. Even the customers, sensing something big was happening, started whispering. Moments later, the phone call ended, and Danielle placed her phone down, a knowing smile on her lips. The manager, now visibly sweating, cleared his throat. Miss Daniels, we just received a call from corporate. It seems there was a misunderstanding. We'll process your withdrawal immediately. Danielle leaned forward, her gaze piercing. A misunderstanding or discrimination? The manager paled, stammering for words. But Danielle wasn't done yet. This was just the beginning. The atmosphere in the bank had shifted. The once confident manager now fidgeted uncomfortably as he signaled for the teller to process Danielle's transaction. The employees, who had been indifferent or even dismissive before, now watched with a mix of curiosity and fear. Danielle folded her arms, her expression unreadable. She wasn't going to let this slide. The teller's hands trembled slightly as she typed into the computer. We, just need a moment to verify the transaction. Danielle arched an eyebrow. You've had plenty of moments already. The manager cleared his throat. I assure you, Miss Daniels, this is just standard procedure. She let out a short, humorless laugh. That's interesting, because I've seen multiple customers walk in, withdraw money, and leave while I've been sitting here waiting. Standard procedure, you say? The customers in the bank, now fully aware of what was happening, began murmuring amongst themselves. Some pulled out their phones, recording the scene. Danielle knew exactly what was happening. They had assumed she didn't belong. They had seen a black woman asking for a large withdrawal and made a judgment call. She turned toward the nearest customer, an older woman who had been watching everything. Ma'am, did they ask you to wait for verification when you made your withdrawal? The woman shook her head. No, dear, they processed mine right away. Danielle looked back at the manager. So tell me again, was this really just a misunderstanding? The manager shifted nervously. He had no good answer. The teller suddenly gasped, staring at her screen. It looks like Ms. Daniels' account is. She didn't finish her sentence, but her expression said it all. The CEO's status had just been revealed. The color drained from the manager's face. He had just humiliated the most powerful person in the company. Danielle smiled coldly. Now let's talk about what happens next. Some shaking their heads in disbelief, others recording everything. The teller, who had originally refused to help Danielle, now looked terrified. She gripped the counter, her face drained of color. Danielle took a deep breath and glanced around. I'm not here for special treatment. I'm here for fairness. And today, you've shown me exactly how you treat people you assume are beneath you. The manager's mouth opened and closed like a fish gasping for air. For the first time in his career, he was the one under scrutiny, and there was no escaping it. Danielle gave him a long, measured look. I think it's time we discuss some major policy changes, don't you? The weight of Danielle's words hung heavy in the air. The manager stood frozen, his mouth slightly open, searching for an excuse, any excuse to save face. But there was none. The damage was done, and the power had shifted entirely in Danielle's favor. The customers in the bank murmured amongst themselves. Some whispered in shock, while others openly recorded, their phones aimed at the unfolding drama. A few people even nodded in approval, recognizing the long-overdue reckoning playing out before them. Danielle leaned in slightly. "Do you know what the worst part of this is?" she asked, her voice steady yet sharp. "It's not just about me. It's about every single person who walks into this bank and gets treated like a second-class citizen because someone behind the counter decided they didn't look right." The manager gulped. "Miss Daniels, I assure you." She raised a hand, silencing him. "No, you don't assure me. You assure the people who trust this bank with their hard-earned money. Do you think they feel valued right now?" The crowd responded before he could. "No," one woman called out. "This happens all the time." Another customer, a middle-aged black man, nodded grimly. "I've had them double-check my ID every time I withdraw my own money, but the guy before me never had to." Danielle turned back to the manager. "You hear that? This isn't an isolated incident. It's a pattern, a culture." The manager's forehead glistened with sweat. He opened his mouth but had no defense. Danielle exhaled and straightened her posture. "I built this bank from the ground up. I trusted you all to uphold its values. But today, you've shown me that change is needed, immediately." She turned to the employees. "Starting now, we're implementing new policies. And trust me, failure to comply won't just mean losing a customer. It'll mean losing your job." The manager swallowed hard. The gravity of the moment was sinking in. Danielle's voice rang clear through the bank. "Because in this establishment, discrimination will no longer be tolerated." A new era was about to begin, and she was leading the charge. The air in the bank was thick with tension. Employees shifted uncomfortably, some exchanging nervous glances while others stood rigid, waiting for the fallout. The manager looked like he wanted to disappear, his face pale, his hands gripping the edge of the counter. Danielle turned toward the security guard who had first questioned her. "And you," she said, her voice firm but not unkind, "do you believe you were doing your job fairly today?" The guard hesitated. He had started the whole ordeal by assuming she was a problem rather than a valued customer. Worse, his boss. He glanced at the floor. "I was just following procedure," he muttered. Danielle arched a brow. "Was it procedure to ignore my ID and my account information, or was it just instinct to assume I didn't belong?" The guard swallowed hard but said nothing. Danielle exhaled sharply. "Listen, I'm not here to humiliate anyone, but what happened today isn't just about me. It's about a systemic issue that goes unchecked every single day." She turned back to the manager. "How many people have you treated like this before? How many loyal customers have walked out because they were made to feel like criminals?" The manager had no answer. He simply stood there, exposed in front of his employees and customers. Danielle looked around at the faces in the crowd, some nodding in agreement, others watching intently, waiting to see what she would do next. She knew this was more than just a personal slight. This was an opportunity to create real change. Taking a deep breath, she made a decision. Effective immediately, this bank is undergoing a full review of its policies, and I will personally oversee the changes. The crowd murmured in approval. Employees shifted, unsure of what that meant for them. And as for leadership, she turned back to the manager, who looked like he already knew what was coming. "We'll be having a serious discussion about your future here." The manager's face turned an even deeper shade of red, but he didn't argue. He knew there was no coming back from this. Danielle turned to the customers. "If anyone has ever felt mistreated by this branch, I want to hear your story. Starting today, I promise you, this bank will be different." A ripple of applause spread through the crowd. The shift had begun, and Danielle Daniels was just getting started. The energy in the bank had shifted. Customers whispered among themselves, some shaking their heads in disbelief, others nodding in agreement. Danielle stood firm, her presence now commanding the room. The staff, including the security guard, remained frozen in place, waiting for what would come next. Then, an elderly black woman stepped forward. She adjusted her glasses and cleared her throat. "Miss Daniels," she said, her voice strong despite her age. "I've been banking here for over 20 years, and I've seen this kind of treatment before. But today, you've given me hope." Danielle's expression softened. "Thank you," she said sincerely. But it shouldn't have to take someone like me to bring change. This should never happen in the first place. The woman nodded, looking around at the others. She's right. I've been denied service here before. They made me wait for an hour once, pretending like my account didn't exist. A middle-aged man chimed in. Same here. Last year, I came in to withdraw money for my daughter's tuition, and they treated me like a fraud. Danielle glanced at the manager, who looked increasingly uncomfortable. The weight of his actions and the bank's failures was closing in on him. I want statements, Danielle declared. Anyone who's experienced discrimination at this branch, step forward. This ends today. One by one, customers spoke up. Their stories wove a painful pattern of systemic mistreatment. Danielle listened carefully, taking mental notes. She would not let this be swept under the rug. Then she pulled out her phone and made a call. Mr. Reynolds, she said, addressing the bank's regional director, I need you to come to this branch immediately. We have a serious problem that requires your attention. The manager's face drained of color. He knew his fate had just been sealed. Danielle looked around at the gathered crowd. You all deserve better, and from today forward you'll get it. The fight for justice had only just begun. It didn't take long for the news to spread. By the time Mr. Reynolds, the bank's regional director, arrived, the branch was buzzing with tension. Customers stood in clusters, murmuring about what had just happened. Employees shifted nervously, avoiding eye contact with Danielle, who stood confidently near the teller counters. The glass doors swung open, and a tall, sharp-dressed man in a navy blue suit strode inside. His nameplate gleamed under the fluorescent lights. David Reynolds, regional director. His face was set in a neutral expression, but his sharp eyes scanned the room, taking in the uneasy employees and frustrated customers. Danielle stepped forward before anyone else could speak. Mr. Reynolds, I assume you're aware of the situation? He turned to her, offering a polite but cautious nod. Ms. Daniels, I was told you had an urgent complaint. I'd like to hear it directly from you. She didn't hesitate. Your employees refused to allow me to withdraw my own money. They humiliated me, treated me like a fraud, and only changed their tune when they saw my name on their system. And judging by the stories I've heard today, I'm not the only one who's been mistreated here. Reynolds' gaze flickered to the bank manager, who stood stiffly, hands clasped in front of him. Is this true? The manager hesitated, then stammered. Sir, I didn't realize who she was. It was a misunderstanding. Danielle's voice was firm. A misunderstanding that seems to happen only to people who look like me. A murmur of agreement rippled through the crowd. Reynolds inhaled deeply, his lips pressing into a thin line. He turned to the elderly woman who had spoken earlier. Ma'am, you also had issues with this branch? She nodded. More than once, and I know plenty of others who have too. Reynolds nodded slowly. Then, to everyone's shock, he turned to the manager. Pack your things. You're done here. Gasps filled the room. The manager's face went pale. Sir, please. You've embarrassed this institution and treated customers unfairly, Reynolds interrupted coldly. I won't allow that under my leadership. Danielle raised an eyebrow. Under your leadership? She repeated. I think we need to discuss that further. Reynolds stiffened. He wasn't in control of the situation anymore. She was. A tense silence filled the bank as all eyes remained on Danielle and Mr. Reynolds. The recently dismissed manager stood frozen, his face pale as if he couldn't process what had just happened. Meanwhile, the tellers exchanged nervous glances, clearly realizing that this was more than just a routine customer complaint. Danielle crossed her arms, her confidence unwavering. Now that we've dealt with him, she said, motioning toward the ex-manager, we need to talk about what happens next. Mr. Reynolds adjusted his tie, his expression unreadable. Ms. Daniels, I assure you, we take these matters seriously. That's why I stepped in personally. But I don't think you understand the weight of this decision. Firing a branch manager so quickly. Danielle cut him off. No, Mr. Reynolds, I do understand the weight of this decision. I built this bank from the ground up. I know its policies inside and out, and I know that what happened today is unacceptable. A few gasps rippled through the customers, and even the tellers widened their eyes. Some had suspected who she was, but now it was confirmed. The woman they had just mistreated was the CEO of the entire bank. Reynolds's posture stiffened. Ms. Daniels, I didn't realize. That's the problem, she said firmly. You shouldn't have to realize who someone is to treat them with dignity and respect. This isn't just about me. It's about every customer who has walked in here and been made to feel like they don't belong. A woman in the crowd nodded. That's right. I've been banking here for years, but I always feel like they don't trust me. A younger man added, They act like we're criminals just for wanting access to our own money. Danielle turned back to Reynolds. This branch has serious issues, and if it's happening here, it's probably happening in other locations too. Reynolds nodded slowly, realizing she was right. What do you propose? Danielle took a step forward, her voice firm and unwavering. An immediate audit of all branches, anonymous customer surveys, and an overhaul of our training programs, because if employees don't understand basic respect, they have no place in this company. Reynolds exhaled, then extended his hand. I'll work with you on that. Danielle shook his hand, but her mind was already moving forward. This was just the beginning. Danielle took a deep breath, feeling the weight of the moment. The people in the bank, customers and employees alike, were still processing what had just unfolded. But she knew that exposing the problem was only the first step. Real change had to follow. She turned back to the tellers and staff. From now on, every customer in this bank will be treated with the respect they deserve. Discrimination, whether subtle or obvious, will not be tolerated. A few employees exchanged uneasy glances, while others nodded in agreement. Some were clearly worried about their jobs, realizing that the way they had been treating customers might no longer be ignored. Mr. Reynolds, still adjusting to the shift in power, cleared his throat. Ms. Daniels, I agree with your concerns, and I want to assure you that we take this seriously. But we also need a strategy to ensure long-term success. Danielle nodded. That's why we're implementing a new customer-first initiative. We're going to retrain every employee, top to bottom, on proper banking etiquette, customer service, and most importantly, unconscious bias. An older woman in the crowd spoke up. It's about time. I've been coming here for years, and every time I feel like they're watching me like a thief. Danielle nodded at her. That ends today. One of the tellers, a young man named Jason, hesitantly raised his hand. Miss Daniels, some of us really do try to treat customers well. But the managers have made it clear that they don't want certain people getting loans or even basic services. Danielle's eyes narrowed. Then those managers will have to go. A stunned silence followed. This was more than just a policy change. Danielle was talking about a complete culture shift. She turned to Reynolds. We'll start with this branch. I want full transparency. I want to see who's been denied loans, who's been charged unfair fees, and whether race played a role. Reynolds hesitated, but eventually nodded. I'll get the reports. Danielle faced the staff once more. For those of you who believe in fairness and equality, you have nothing to worry about. But for those who think they can get away with discrimination, consider this your final warning. The message was clear. This wasn't just about one bad manager. This was about an entire system that needed to change. And Danielle was ready to make sure that happened. Danielle sat in the conference room, reviewing the reports that Mr. Reynolds had gathered. As she flipped through the documents, her frustration grew. The evidence was undeniable. A pattern of discrimination had been embedded in the bank's system for years. Loan approvals for Black and minority customers were significantly lower than those for white applicants with similar financial backgrounds. Some customers were charged higher fees for no clear reason. And then there were the internal complaints, tellers and employees who had raised concerns only to be ignored or even retaliated against. She placed the papers down and took a deep breath. This is worse than I expected. Reynolds shifted uncomfortably in his seat. I won't deny it, but we can fix this, right? Danielle's expression hardened. Not we. I will fix it. And it starts with accountability. She called for a staff meeting, bringing together every employee in the branch. The tension in the room was thick as she stood before them. Many of you have been working under a system that was broken before you even got here. But let me make one thing clear. That system ends today. She turned toward the managers, her voice sharp. I've reviewed reports, complaints, and customer records. Some of you have been directly responsible for mistreating people based on race, background, or economic status. Murmurs spread through the room. Some employees exchanged nervous glances. Others, especially those who had long been frustrated by the unfair treatment, looked relieved. Danielle continued, "Effective immediately, there will be terminations and reassignments. Anyone who has actively engaged in discriminatory behavior will no longer have a place here." A senior manager, Mr. Calloway, stepped forward. "Ms. Daniels, let's be reasonable. Some of these practices have been in place for decades, changing everything overnight." "Stop," Danielle interrupted. "Are you telling me that bias and racism should be excused because it's been happening for decades?" Calloway hesitated. "That's not what I meant." "Then let me be clear. If you believe that what's been happening here is acceptable, you do not belong in this bank." The room fell silent. Danielle's eyes swept over the crowd. "Those who are willing to be part of the change, I will support you. We will provide new training, adjust policies, and create a workplace where every customer is treated fairly. But if you think you can continue business as usual, you're free to leave." A few employees shifted uncomfortably. Calloway clenched his jaw, clearly displeased, but said nothing. Danielle let the silence linger. "This is your chance to decide whether you stand for fairness or corruption." She knew some people wouldn't change. Some might even try to fight back, but she wasn't afraid. This wasn't just about fixing a broken bank. It was about setting an example for the entire industry. The next morning, Danielle arrived at the bank earlier than usual. She stood in the main lobby, watching as employees trickled in, their expressions a mix of nervousness and anticipation. Change was happening, and everyone could feel it. She had spent the previous night drafting new policies and working with her legal team to ensure that any employees guilty of discriminatory practices were removed immediately. By the time the bank opened, 3 senior managers, including Calloway, had been officially terminated. As the first customers entered, Danielle observed how the tellers greeted them. This time, there were no second glances, no questioning stares. The energy was different. A familiar face walked through the door. Mr. Jenkins, the elderly black man who had been humiliated days before. Danielle stepped forward. "Mr. Jenkins, welcome back," she said with a warm smile. The old man eyed her curiously. "Miss, you look familiar. Wait, you're—" She nodded. "Danielle Daniels, CEO of this bank." His eyes widened. "Well, I'll be damned, you're the one who—" He shook his head, laughing softly. "You tricked him good, didn't you?" Danielle chuckled. "You could say that, but I'm here to make sure what happened to you never happens again." She guided him to the counter, where the new branch manager personally assisted him. This time, there was no hesitation, no unnecessary paperwork, just a smooth, professional transaction. As Mr. Jenkins finished, he turned to Danielle. "You know, I almost closed my account after what happened, but now, I think I'll stay. I trust you." Danielle smiled. "That means everything to me." As he walked out, Danielle felt a surge of pride. This was only the beginning. Over the next few months, the bank became a case study in corporate reform. Diversity training was implemented, fair lending policies were enforced, and customers of all backgrounds noticed the shift. The media caught wind of the story. News outlets covered how a black CEO went undercover, exposed discrimination, and transformed her own bank. Danielle sat in her office, looking out the window. She had faced resistance, backlash, and outright racism, but she had also made a difference. As she leaned back in her chair, her phone rang. Danielle Daniels speaking. A voice on the other end said, "Miss Daniels, I'm calling on behalf of the National Banking Association. We'd love for you to speak at our next conference on banking reform." Danielle grinned. "I'd be honored." She had come into the bank to withdraw money, but instead she withdrew ignorance, injustice, and discrimination. And in its place, she deposited change. If you were inspired by Danielle's story, remember, change starts with awareness and action. Support Black-owned businesses and banks. Speak up against discrimination when you see it. Educate yourself and others on fair financial practices. Advocate for diversity and inclusion in workplaces. Share this story to spread awareness, and let's build a future where everyone is treated with dignity and respect, no matter who they are. Please subscribe.